Hello, my name is Bernice Ledbetter. I'm a professor at Union Institute and University in Cincinnati, Ohio in the PhD program in Interdisciplinary Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Dr. Terry Price. This session is sponsored by the Leadership Scholarship Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association. I will serve as moderator for our session, and we are delighted you could join us for this webinar series. A word about how we will proceed. Dr. Price will share his research with us, followed by time for questions and answers. So I encourage you to submit your questions using the questions field on your screen, and we will take up those questions at the conclusion of Dr. Price's presentation. And now let me introduce our esteemed speaker. Terry L. Price is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Associate Professor at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond, Virginia. He holds a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Arizona, as well as degrees in philosophy, politics, and psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the University of Oxford. Price serves as a series editor of Jepson Studies in Leadership and is co-editor of 3 important volumes: the International Library of Leadership, The Quest for Moral Leaders, and The Values of Presidential Leadership. And he is author of 2 outstanding books. The first, Understanding Ethical Failures in Leadership, and most recently, Leadership Ethics and Introduction, both on Cambridge University Press. When I asked Dr. Price how he came to this interest in leadership and morality, he shared the following with me. He said, "I've long been people's beliefs about morality and how this affects their behavior and the way we respond to them. Even my dissertation research focused on the moral responsibility of people who hold mistaken moral beliefs." The first book, with Cambridge, Understanding Ethical Failures in Leadership, picks up on the idea of mistaken beliefs about justification and uses it to explain immoral leadership. The most recent book, Leadership Ethics, asks whether leaders might be justified in breaking the moral rules after all. In other words, it asks, is there something distinctive about leadership that puts leaders beyond the scope of moral rules? Dr. Price, we're excited to hear your thoughts today. Please share with us your current thinking on justification in leadership ethics.
Thank you very much, Bernice. Thanks for introducing me and for agreeing to moderate this session. I know it's earlier for you out in California than it is for many of us. I really appreciate your doing it. I also want to thank the ILA staff, especially Josh Tarr, for setting up this webinar. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. What I'm going to try to do is 4 things drawing on the book. The first is I'm going to suggest that leadership ethics is more complicated than people ordinarily think. And this has to do with the fact that I think self-interest doesn't play as much of a role in leadership ethics as people think it does. Second, I'm going to try to defend the claim that this complication is intrinsic to leadership. In fact, I think there's a tension between leadership and ethics, something about exception making built into the very concept of leadership. Third, I'm going to consider plausible resolutions that may allow leaders to break the rules, and all of these resolutions are grounded in moral theory, so I'll get to that later in the presentation as well. The final thing I'll do is to suggest that none of these resolutions work, that I think in the end leaders have a moral obligation to follow the rules. Leadership ethics generally starts from a dichotomy between villains and heroes, and this is true, I think, both in the popular literature and in the scholarly literature. What I've done here is to give you a short list of villains and a short list of heroes, with Hitler and Jim Jones and Madoff in the list of villains. And Madoff is relatively new. He had to knock someone else off the old list. And in the heroes category, I have Lincoln and FDR and King. And this list is in no way is there meant to be any kind of equality within the category. So I'm not implying that anyone suggests that Madoff is as bad as Jones or as Hitler, but the idea is that this is the way we generally think about leadership and think about leadership ethics. There are others in these lists as well. The lists are not exhaustive. So if we were in a room together, I would ask everyone to give me their favorites, and we would make a very long list on both sides. The next question then people are inclined to ask in leadership ethics is, well, what differentiates the villainous leaders from the heroic leaders? How are they different from each other? And the answer ordinarily appeals to something about motivation, how these different leaders are motivated to behave as they behave. And we learn that villainous leaders are motivated by self-interest. The heroic leaders, in contrast, are motivated by the good of others. The villainous leaders are egoistic. The heroic leaders are altruistic. The villainous leaders are committed to personal ends, the things that they care about, and the heroic leaders are committed to group ends, the things that others care about. And then this distinction, I think, finds its way into a lot of the scholarship in leadership ethics as well. For example, in distinctions such as Bass's distinction between pseudo-transformational leadership and authentic transformational leadership, where you could look in many cases at the way these leaders are motivated to decide whether or not they are pseudo-transformational or authentic transformational leaders. Now, according to this general view, leadership ethics then is fairly simple. When we're trying to decide how to behave ethically, we ought to look at the heroes and try to be more like them, look at the villains, try to be less like them. We want to find ourselves in the right category, not in the wrong category. And then the basic conclusion of these approaches is that ethical leadership is what focuses on the good of the group ends, not on personal ends, motivated again by the good of others, and not by self-interest. So it all looks fairly simple. We figure out who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. We decide what differentiates the two groups, and then we try to become more like the one and less like the other. In the book, I take a different approach and try to ask what I think is a more philosophically interesting question. And that's the question, in my mind, is not how are they different from each other, but rather what do they have in common? In what ways are they alike? What does all leadership share? What kinds of temptations will the good leader face in the same way the bad leader might face the temptation? And the answer, I think, is something about the moral psychology of leadership. In particular, I suggest that there's a central belief about justification that is something that all leaders will be exposed to. And this belief is that leaders are sometimes justified in doing what other people aren't allowed to do. Now, it's true of the villains in a very obvious way. We see individuals who look as though they're running around and doing whatever it is they can do to maximize their own self-interest, and they see that they believe that they are above the group and don't have to live by the same kinds of rules. But it's also true, I think, of the heroic leaders, or the leaders that we see as being heroic. If you think back to my very minimal list of the heroic leaders, Lincoln, for example, suspended habeas corpus in the Civil War. FDR, many historians suggest that he used deception and would be willing to use whatever, no, I shouldn't say whatever means necessary, but go to extreme lengths to achieve what he thought needed to be achieved and to get the United States into the Second World War. King himself said that sometimes it's justified to break the law. If the law is unjust, then it's unjustified. Or you could have a just law that's applied unjustly. and you would be justified in breaking that law. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's something about the notion of leadership itself, the way we think about it, and how leaders think about themselves, that has this idea of change, deviation, innovation, the kinds of things that can be in direct conflict with rule following. Now, one of the scholars, or I should say the scholar, I think, that has the most to say about this, the grounding for this phenomenon is E.P. Hollander, who has done wonderful research for decades. Some of his very early research was on the way leaders emerge from groups. And if you're familiar with his research, you'll recall that he had problem-solving experiments where one individual who was a Confederate knew the answer to the problem. The other individuals didn't know, and of course didn't know that this individual was a Confederate. The group would decide upon rules that everyone should follow, and they would come up with rules about majority rule, and they would say that each member of the group should speak in turn. And in the beginning, in the early stages, Hollander would have this individual, the Confederate, conform to the rules, follow the rules, and display competence. And of course he could display competence because he knew the answer to the puzzle. But in later stages, he would break the rules, that he would go against majority rule, he would speak out of turn. And the interesting fact is that the individuals within the group would allow him to do it. In fact, they expected him to do it. They would allow him to do it in a way they wouldn't allow others. When others tried to deviate, they would point out that they would say, number 3, it's not your turn, but they would allow the Confederate to do it, and indeed they expected him to do so. And part of Hollander's argument is that once you emerge as a leader, your role, responsibilities change, the expectations of you change, and not only do leaders come to see themselves as being justified in doing things other people can't do, but we see them that way as well. And in fact, we might think they're not justified if they refuse to break the rules for the good of the group. This aspect of, I think, the way we think about leadership also comes out in the terminology we use, the way we talk about leadership and the way we've talked about it historically. If you think about words such, for example, ruler versus ruled, the ruler is someone who makes the rules and maybe can break the rules as well. And that individual contrasts, at least in our thinking sometimes, with the ruled, the person who's following those rules. Now, so we take this basic distinction between the villains and the heroes, and we see that both groups have some elements of, or share some elements of their moral psychology. Then you can ask the question, well, with whom then do everyday leaders identify when they break the rules? Well, this dichotomy, or the sharp split, I think, between villains and heroes, makes it very easy for everyday leaders to rationalize and say, my rule breaking is part of a long tradition of heroic leadership. And when they break the rules, they can say, I did it for us and for our goals, not myself. It wasn't selfish. And that way they can distinguish themselves fairly easily from the villains, put themselves in the same camp or category with the heroes, and then at least feel justified, even if they aren't, in breaking the rules. I have two words highlighted there on the screen in front of you. I did it for us and our goals. Those basic ideas are going to be very central as we move forward. The first one, us, the notion of who we are as a group, the collective, the organization working together. And then this other idea of, which I have the collective element there with the word our, the notion of goals or consequences that people are trying to achieve. And you'll see that indeed in the next slide. So I said at the very beginning of the talk that I think there's a conflict between leadership as we ordinarily think about it and ethics. So let me first say more about leadership or the features of leadership that drive this conflict, and then I'll say more about ethics as well. There are two features of leadership, I think, that promote beliefs about the justification of exceptionalism. The first is this idea of consequences or ends. Remember I said earlier, our goals. Leadership, to a large extent, is about achievement, about getting things done. If I'm the leader of your group and I'm unable to achieve our goals, probably no matter how moral I am or how much you like me, I'm not going to stay in that position very long. I have to be effective. I have to get things done. This notion, as we saw earlier, was central in Hollander's arguments about allowing a Confederate in the group to deviate from the norms. The person, you can ask, why was he allowed to deviate? Well, he knew the answers, and he was able to help the group achieve the goals. So the achievement of the goals in that case was more important than standing by these rules about majority rule or about speaking in turn. Competence and the consequences that were achieved were determinative in the circumstances. The conflict then sometimes with morality is that leaders can come to believe that they're not bound by the same rules that other people are bound by, that they are an exception. And they're an exception, they may think, for a good reason, because by making an exception of themselves, they're able to help the group achieve its goals. And not only that, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the group is expecting the very same thing. The followers are expecting that this individual will use his or her discretion to decide when to go against the rules, when to deviate, when to innovate in order to help the group achieve its ends. So this notion of consequentialism, achieving ends, achieving goals, a kind of instrumentalism, I think is central to the logic of leadership and the way we think about it, and it has real important ethical consequences. The other aspect of leadership, the other feature that I think feeds into beliefs about the justification of exceptionalism is this idea of partiality or the group. Remember I said that the everyday leader can say, I'm like the heroes, I did it, and but I did it for us and not for myself, and that's the justification. This kind of preference for us, I believe, is also a central part of the way we think about leadership. If I am a leader of your group or potentially a leader of your group and I tell you, I'll just have you know that your interest will count no more for me than the interest of anyone else in the world, I'm guessing that you're going to say, no thanks, I'll find someone else, because groups and followers and people ordinarily expect leaders to pay special attention to group members and their interest, and that's probably true no matter how cosmopolitan that leader is, no matter how open that leader might be to other people and their interests. There's still a sense in which when push comes to shove, we expect the leader to look out for us, to put us first. The danger, of course, then, is that leaders can come to believe that others aren't protected by the same rules, that they don't deserve the same kind of protections that group members get. So here with leadership, and what I think are very central features to the way we often think about leadership, are two causes of exceptionalism. One, the consequentialism that causes leaders to think they're exceptions, they're beyond the rules, and another kind of exceptionalism, which you might understand in terms of exclusion, that some individuals are excluded or can be excluded from morality in a way that group members should not be. Okay, now to ethics, what I have here is two features of ethics that I think prohibit exceptionalism. So here again, I'm trying to build up this conflict or tension between leadership as we ordinarily think about it and ethics as we also ordinarily think about it, or I will suggest as we ought to think about it. A lot of ethics sees rational agents as being equal to each other, as moral equals, and therefore equally bound and equally protected by morality, that no one is special and that no one is beneath the rules. So the first bullet point on this slide, ethics allows no one to be above the rules. There's a large focus on the means as opposed to the ends, that there are certain kinds of actions that are right and wrong in and of themselves, and you can't break those rules. You can't engage in immoral means just to achieve your consequences. And then here we have that nice clean tension, I think, between this aspect of ethics and what I call part of the the consequentialist logic of leadership, the focus on the ends. Then the second bullet point, ethics allows no one to be below the rules. Many ethical theories are strongly committed to impartiality, which contrasts sharply with the partiality of leadership. And we might say ethics doesn't play favorites, leadership does. Whereas leadership is expected to show some partiality, we think that ethics should be impartial and not play favorites among people. And we think that's true regardless of membership in groups. In my book, Immanuel Kant gets a lot of play, mainly because he's the most respected defender of this conception of ethics. In Kant's view, what's right or wrong is determined by reason, that actions are right and wrong in and of themselves, dependent upon their connection to reason. And if you've read Kant, you'll remember that Kant says you ought only to engage in those actions that you could will that they would become a universal law. And his idea was, if you think about doing some action, say you're thinking of deceiving someone to achieve your ends, you ought to try to imagine a world in which everyone does that. Everyone tries to get their way by deceiving others. And Kant says there is no such world. You get a contradiction. Lying to achieve your ends only works when other people are telling the truth most of the time. So you have to take advantage of other people to make deception or lying work. You have to make an exception of yourself. And Kant says that's unreasonable. If everyone were to do this, there would be no incentive to try it, because it only works, as I said, because most people are telling the truth most of the time. There's this backdrop of truth. And this, you can also articulate the second bullet point in terms of reason as well. No one's below the rules because we're all rational agents, and we have to respect their rationality independently of group membership. So they get the same kind of protection. They cannot be excluded. They are moral equals to us. Now, sometimes people suggest, well, Kant's basically advocating the golden rule. He's suggesting that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's some truth to that, but it's a little particularistic and partial, I think, to talk about in terms of what you would have others do to you. If you try to translate it into Kantian terms, I think you would come up with something such as do unto others as you would have everyone do unto everyone else all the time. So the fact that you're choosing something that you would do unto everyone all the time gets at this real universalistic aspect of Kant's theory. The fact that you're doing it unto everyone gets at the notion of impartiality. So it has to be much more universal and impartial than people sometimes talk about the golden rule. Okay, so what I've just done with the last two slides is to try to set up this tension between leadership and ethics leadership focusing on the ends and on partiality, ethics focusing on the means and impartiality. And someone might say, well, that's all there is to it then, that if you're a Kantian or a good Kantian, then you just have to give up a lot of aspects of leadership. But our normal thinking about ethics is more complex than this. Most of us don't think that the rules should be followed all the time, that there are no exceptions to the rules. So most of us aren't strict Kantians. So what I'm going to do is try to develop this idea of the complexity of moral reasoning and then let it lead into a discussion of justification for leaders. The way I'm going to do this is to talk about a story in Plato's Republic, The Ring of Gyges, which if you read Plato's Republic, you remember that there is a story of the shepherd Gyges who finds a ring. He finds it on the hand of a corpse, and he pulls it off, takes it, puts it on his own hand, and then he is playing around with the ring, and he turns it and notices that he becomes invisible when he turns the ring. And what does Gyges do? Well, when he goes to the annual meeting with the king to discuss the state of his flock, he uses the ring, he makes himself invisible, he seduces the queen, he kills the king, and he takes over the kingdom. And the point of Glaucon's story is that we would all do the same thing. This is very much in line with the explanations of leadership that appeal to self-interest and say that, well, leaders get rings, in a sense, make themselves invisible and behave that way. Now, what I'm going to do is not focus on it so much, or I should say, I'm not going to focus solely on the self-interest aspect of all this, but I'm going to try to use it to get us to think about the complexity of moral reasoning. If we were all in a room together, I would ask you to write down on a note card what it is that you would do, if anything, that other people might see as being unethical. And then I would collect them up, and they would be anonymous, and I would read them aloud, and then we would sort them. But since we're not all in a room together, as much as I wish we were, we're going to have to do something different. And here I think Josh is going to help us with an audience poll. I'll show you what the basic responses are, and I think Josh will be able to get the poll up for everyone to look at. What I would like for you to do is to, as opposed to picking one of these responses, picking a category, I would rather that you think about the question, if you had a ring that made you invisible, would you do anything that other people might see as being unethical? So think about the particular kinds of things you would do. And once you've done that, then pick a category and base your response on that, if you would. While you're thinking about that, I'll tell you my most interesting story doing this exercise. I've done it with thousands of students, I think, and almost every professional group I've worked with. And I was working with a group of government officials around the time of an election, and I asked them to tell me what they would do, and lots of people were talking, giving responses about the election. And they were saying things such as, I would rig the ballot box, and people would chuckle. And then I got to a response where someone said, snuff out W. And I always read these responses as quickly as I could, and I read it. There was some nervous laughter, and I kept going, and didn't think a whole lot more about it because people had been joking and they weren't completely serious in their responses. And the next morning I'm sitting in my office and I get a call from the Secret Service, and they tell me they want to know who made that response. And I told them that I had thrown away the responses which I had and which I always do, and they said, we need to know the trash can because we'll then find the card and do fingerprinting analysis and handwriting analysis. And I finally convinced them to let me see if the person would come forward, and they said, you have until 3 o'clock. And the person did. and everything worked out okay. But now I'm a lot more careful about reading responses, and many times I don't read responses, I just leave them out. Okay, I think we've had plenty of time. I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Sure, Terry. About 75 people, over 75 people or percentage have voted so far. 44% have chosen no, I would not use the ring. 31% have 32% have chosen yes, I would use the ring to promote self-interest. 41% said the third answer, yes, I would, only for reasons other than self-interest.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. I think all three responses are interesting in their own way. The first one, and we had a lot of people who said they would not use the ring, is closest to this kind of Kantian perspective that some actions are just wrong in and of themselves and shouldn't be done. And if you think about it, I mean, even using the ring itself is an act of deception. People don't, to get things done with the ring you couldn't do otherwise, you do have to deceive people, and some people are saying, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't engage in that action. Those actions are intrinsically wrong. The self-interest explanation fits very nicely with the explanation that Glaucon thinks helps us understand immoral behavior generally, and it supports the self-interest explanation that I think is at the heart of much of the literature on leadership, both the popular and the scholarly literature, that people are motivated by self-interest. If you had the chance to behave in a self-interested way, you would. And there's some truth to that one as well. It's the third response, though, that I think is the most interesting and the most neglected when we think about these kinds of questions. And this is the response, which says, yes, I would use it, but only for reasons other than self-interest. The interesting thing about this response to me is that it shows a real complexity in the way we think about morality. And I think we all can do it independently of whether we think it's the right thing to do, but it shows that we can see that an action is immoral for the most part, generally, regularly immoral, that it shouldn't be done, and we can say sometimes it's okay to do it, that you're outside the scope of that requirement. So deception, for example. We all know that there's something problematic about deception. It would be hard to avoid learning that prohibition, learning that requirement in our society. Yet most people, or a lot of people, are willing in some cases to tell a lie or think that it's morally appropriate to tell a lie, and maybe even morally required to tell a lie, to deceive someone else. So there's this distinction between the content, what the principle requires, what morality requires, the action that should or shouldn't be done, and the scope of that requirement in a particular case. And that comes out, I think, in our poll with the Gaiji's example, that people who would use the ring and use it for purposes other than self-interest might have, very likely went through this in the past, or most likely have the explanation that, yes, this action is generally not the right thing to do. I would not do it for self-interest, but I would do it for, say, the good of others, for someone else, and that can serve as a justification. Now, this distinction, I think, is especially important for leadership, because leaders sometimes have special reasons to believe they're beyond the scope of morality in the circumstances in which they find themselves. So leaders can believe these actions ought not to be done generally, but I have a special justification for doing them. The requirement or prohibition does not apply to me in my circumstances, although I recognize the content of the requirement. So what are these reasons? what I do in the book is I try to go through what I think are the main reasons a leader might give for breaking the rules, and I devote pretty much a chapter to each reason. I have 5 here. I didn't include them all for the sake of time, but 5 of the most prominent ones. The first one, the leader broke the rules because he could, focuses just on the power, the fact that this individual had power to break the rules, and so did. The second one, because we said he could, here's the notion of consent. In morality, some actions can be wrong to do, but can be permissible if people consent to them. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street and someone walks up and punches me in the arm, then I've been harmed, I've been wronged in some fashion. If instead I walk up to this individual and I say, please hit me in the arm, it's okay, I consent to it, I will allow you to do it, and the person does it, then I have no right to complain. You know, there's a saying in the law, what was done voluntarily you cannot wrong yourself with those kinds of things. So the consent may be justified. The next one, because she had to, the leader broke the rules because she had to. This is a necessity justification. I think it's very common in leadership that leaders say, I had to do it. There was no choice. I had no options. It was a matter of necessity. And I think it gets an awful lot of play in leadership, and I'll come back to that one as well. Because the leader broke the rules because she has special obligations to the group. Leadership is a relationship with roles, and it's a relationship within a group of people. And so it makes sense to think about it as having something special in this relationship that doesn't exist in other relationships, that leaders owe something to followers that they don't owe to other people, that group members owe something to each other that they don't owe to other people. And so this kind of justification makes perfect sense as a possibility for thinking about exception making in leadership. And then finally, because it was for a higher cause, sometimes leaders justify things by the greater good. If you have to break a rule, and in so doing, by so doing, you've achieved some great end, maybe that's justifying. So those are just 5 possible justifications a leader could give to give a moral grounding for breaking the rules, for making an exception of him or herself. Now, I said at the beginning of the talk that I think self-interest gets a lot more credit than it should get, that it plays some role probably, but not nearly as large a role as people think it does. And what I'm trying to do here is to show the sources of the justifications that I just described. And if you'll notice, the self-interest plays a role in the first, but not as large a role, I don't think, in the others. The others focus on the aspects, the features of leadership I talked about earlier, the consequentialism of leadership and the partiality of leadership. And one of the main claims of my book is that these are neglected features of thinking about leadership ethics, and they play a much larger role in leadership ethics than people are inclined to admit. So the first explanation, because he could, relies upon self-interest, but the others do not. The consent justification, because we said he could, of course, gets its justification from the group, the fact that we as a group, as followers, allow him or expect him to break the rules. And that's where, if there is a justification, this is one way to think about where that justification is coming from. Because she had to do it, that's a very consequentialist explanation. If someone says, I had to do it, then the next question is, for what? Why did you have to do it? And the for what's going to give you, the answer to the for what question will give you a consequence. It will give you an end that has to be achieved. And she may well say, I did it for our ends and not for something such as self-interest. Special obligations to the group here again is a group-based source of justification, not one based in self-interest. It has to do with the relationship of the leader to group members and group members to each other. Because it was for a higher cause, a clearly consequentialist explanation. If someone did something for the collective good, it was to achieve some end, and here again, it's not necessarily a self-interested end, and if it's for the higher cause or someone claims it is, then it's hard to understand it that way. It's for the collective good. It's for something greater. So my point here is that partiality and consequentialism are doing a lot of the work in justification, and self-interest is playing, I think, less role in explanation than people ordinarily think. So that leads us to the question of, well, do these justifications work in the end? And what I've done here in this slide is to pair up each justification not with this source of justification, but with a moral theory. Not all moral theorists are Kantians, and so there are many other moral theories a person could appeal to justify behavior, indeed to justify rule breaking, and these other theories are not as strict as Kant's theory. So you see with the justification, because he could, is tied, I think, most closely to the theory of ethical egoism, which holds that the right action is the action that maximizes self-interest. And what I do in the book is to go through each of these arguments and to analyze and critique them. For ethical egoism, my basic argument is it's hard to see how saying something is my interest gives you an added reason to let me do it. If you probably already know if I've chosen to break a rule out of self-interest, you already know that it was in my self-interest. And so when I tell you it's for my interest, I haven't told you anything new. So it's hard to imagine how that can work as a justification. Because we said he could, in political theory, there's a very reputable tradition, the social contract theory, that says the source of morality and this source of social rules comes from this contract. Now, consent, as I said earlier, can justify some behaviors. It can make things that were thought to be morally problematic, morally permissible. But it's hard to see how followers consenting to a leader's behavior could justify it. In fact, it looks as though it would simply make the followers complicit in whatever immoral action was carried out. Situationism, because she had to. Sometimes necessity justifications work. If I have to tell a lie to save your life, it does look like I had to do it. And you might say, and you probably would say, not only because it's your life, but in general because you think life is valuable, that it was a justification. What happens in leadership context, though, I think, is that when you ask the question, had to for what, it's had to not for because of a matter of life or death, but rather to achieve organizational goals, to achieve some end. So when you say, well, why did you have to do it? And the person says, well, if I didn't do it, I couldn't achieve our goals. That's necessity, but it's a much weaker kind of necessity than the strong necessity of saving someone's life. And I don't think it has very promising as a moral argument. Special obligations to the group. There's a theory in politics called communitarianism, which says your moral obligations and duties are determined by your identity, who you are, and who you are is determined by the group you're a member of. So in some ways it fits quite nicely. Communitarian theory, though, says that I'm getting a little feedback here in the mic. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Communitarian theory says that your obligations as a member of a country, for example, you get them not because you've chosen them, and that's true, you're born into a country, or the obligations you have to your parents. You didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose your children, that these are part of your identity and they're not chosen obligations, but you have them nonetheless. And that's the way they think about moral identity and the obligations that we have to each other. It doesn't work quite as well in a leadership context, I don't think, because most leadership positions are taken on voluntarily. It's not as though you're born into them in the same way that you are born into a family or born into a country. And it looks like it's the kind of thing you can consent to and take them on voluntarily. And also, there are general aspects of morality that will apply to people regardless of what special obligations they have. So it's just not clear how having special obligations to the group can justify breaking more general moral rules. Finally, cosmopolitanism, or this is a cluster of theories that focuses on some end or some end that stands out as being morally better than other ends. Utilitarianism is probably the most famous version of this, and I think it has the most promise of any of these justifications or any of these moral theories for justifying rule breaking. But still it has a real negative, and that negative is I'm hoping I'm still, I got a muted signal, but I'm hoping I'm still here. The problem with cosmopolitan theories is that there will be disagreement about what ends people want to pursue. Some ends, such as justice, are agreed upon by everyone, but there's disagreement about how to pursue, how it is we should pursue those ends. And there's also disagreement about the nature of justice itself. Everyone's for it, but we'll have different conceptions of what actually constitutes justice. So I don't have a lot of faith in coming up with an end that will be agreed upon that we think can override the moral rules. In fact, the moral rules are there to make sure we can adjudicate between people who have different conceptions of the higher good. Okay, final slide here. In what I conclude is that none of these moral justifications for rule-breaking work. They all have strengths, but the weaknesses, I think, in the end win out. And that means we should accept a Kantian view of everyday leadership ethics, that everyday leaders are not justified in breaking the rules, that they ought to follow the rules. And I do make quite a lot out of this notion of everyday leadership and say there will be cases where rule breaking is unjustified. You know, I've already mentioned cases of saving someone's life, but in everyday life we don't face those situations. We're not facing terrorist intent on blowing up shopping malls. We're more likely to face unmotivated employees, and that means I think that we ought to follow the rules. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Bernice for questions. I hope people are still hearing me, and I thank you very much for listening to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Price, for this very interesting presentation. And we have some equally interesting questions that we'd like for you to take up. One of our participants asks a question with respect to cross-cultural differences that might exist with respect to the ideas that you've been sharing. So, for instance, in the ring exercise, a participant, are there cultural factors involved in how people might respond to this? And we can think about this out loud. In other words, are there cross-cultural differences with respect to ethics and leadership? Any thoughts about that you have?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I haven't, I'm trying to think. I did this exercise in Dubai once, and it was a very diverse, culturally diverse audience. It wasn't, the responses I got weren't that different, and of course I haven't run statistical analyses on the responses I get. I don't do them as part of research. I didn't notice anything especially odd about the responses. I did find in that context that people seem to be more willing to allow exception making for leaders and leaving leaders to have a certain kind of discretion to break the rules if they need to do so for the good of the group overall. The kind of strictness that comes with Kantian theory, I think, is probably not normal for most moral theories. I think most people who think about morality and I think across context recognize the possibility of the need for deviations. I do consider in the book, and I did talk about it here, cultural relativism as a justification. I mean, it is very much true that different societies have different moral beliefs, different ideas of what we ought to do to be moral people. I see that mainly, though, as an explanation for behavior. And I guess the stance I generally take on these issues is fairly objectivist, that morality is determined by something other than culture, in part because I think, we've seen cultures behave in ways in our own culture at times behave in ways that we think were wrong independently of what we now know our culture thought. That's a great question.
Great. Thank you. Yes, it's probably a question that we could spend the rest of the day talking about. I have another interesting question I'd like to offer to you from one of the participants. You talked earlier about the dialectic between leaders and followers. And one of our participants asks, isn't it the followers who, in a sense, actually gift the leader with this sense of exclusionism that you talked about? And then does this then make the actions of the leader ethical because the followers have granted the leader permission to act with exclusionism? What do you think about that?
Another great question. I do think that followers have a larger role in all this than people have admitted before, and there's a lot of great work on followers coming out right now, and I myself have started thinking more about followership ethics in large part for the very reason the questioner brings up, that I find it difficult to see leaders as being completely responsible for these kinds of behaviors if it is true that followers are not only allowing them to do it, but expecting them to. The person used expression, gifting or consenting, encouraging, expecting. All those things are, will play a role in our moral analysis of the behavior. And so I do think that followers are a big part of the picture, a big part of the story with what's going on with cases of unethical leadership. And then the flip side of that will be there'll be a large part of the story in what goes on with cases of ethical leadership when they are willing to say, for example, no, this consequence isn't worth it. It's our end, but it's not worth what would be necessary to achieve it. And also when they're willing to say, we have to look and make sure we care for the interest of people outside our own group. We do, expect leaders to focus most attention on our group, but not exclusively. And we also expect them to look outside our group. And I think followers will have a large role in making sure that happens.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very comprehensive answer. I have another question from a participant, and I think this represents some common thinking, and so we'd like to hear your response to this question, Dr. Price. Isn't all action ultimately undertaken out of self-interest? I mean, when it comes right down to it, aren't we all just operating out of our own self-interest? Are we not mostly operating from a utilitarian perspective after, of course, this personal consideration? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a thesis in philosophy called psychological egoism, which is different. I mentioned ethical egoism, which says what we ought to do is to pursue our self-interest. The psychological egoist says that all behavior is motivated by self-interest. So whenever you act, you're acting on self-interest. It's a hard theory to disprove, in large part because any action a person engages in can be redescribed as something else. So when you dive on a grenade to save your fellow soldier, then one explanation is you cared for him or her. The other explanation is you would have felt guilty otherwise. You couldn't have lived with the guilt that you felt. People would look down upon you. So in the end, you did it for self-interested reasons. Uh, I'm not convinced by the thesis, though I do say it's hard to disprove given that you can explain away people's behaviors. I do think it can be sometimes very hard not to act in your self-interest, and it can be very hard for leaders not to because it's easier for them to do so. And maybe in some cases you would say it's unreasonably hard not to, in which case I would probably say they're less guilty than they would otherwise be. But I guess I'm just I'm not convinced. I'll give you one other argument against it, which is that when people do seem to make arguments and to work for things such as justice, and it's hard for me to say that I will admit that they desire justice and they want to see justice in the world, but it doesn't look like what's driving the behavior is the desire, what's justifying it. It's justice, that they care about justice, and they would care about it, independently of the effects on them. It's not for them that they're doing it. So I think it's a stretch to try to describe everything in terms of self-interest, but it's a reputable view. It's a hard view to disprove.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Here's a really interesting question. I'm very interested to hear your answer to this. So you referred to everyday leaders and the lack of any justification for rule breaking. However, what types of leaders then might have such justification, and how do you determine what kinds of leaders fall into this category?
Yeah. The hard question, you had to let the hard one get through. It's as attracted as I am to the Kantian view, even I think that there have to be exceptions to things, and some of those exceptions will be for saving life. You can imagine, I think world leaders having to break rules in some cases. I mean, was Lincoln justified in suspending habeas corpus? Maybe. It's going to be difficult, and I don't have any answer to say when you can do it and when you can't do it. In the first book, I talked quite a bit about what you should do if you're thinking about breaking the rule, and here I relied upon some of King's work on civil disobedience, that if you're going to break the rules, if you think it's that important, then you have to be willing, for example, to make it public, that people have to know what you're doing. In the end, I think the leader cannot be the judge, cannot be the one to decide if he's justified or not. That's the problem, is that leaders are going to think that they're exceptional. They'll treat their own case as being special, and so they can't decide. So if they choose and feel they have to choose to break the rule, it has to be done in a way that's public so that other people can assess it. And another thing King said, which I think is probably right too, is being willing to accept consequences for doing it. If you think it's the right thing to do and you had to do it, then you probably ought to also think that it's important enough to accept a punishment if there is one. Now, if everyone thinks, if people are willing to affirm your justification, then there may be no punishment involved. But I want to leave the possibility open. I want to say that most of us don't face it most of the time, but leave it there for the special case.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Price. For those of you who wrote more very interesting questions, and I'm so sorry we've run out of time to take them, if you would like to follow up with Dr. Price, you can do so at his email, which is tprice@richmond.edu, tprice@richmond.edu. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Price, for these provocative and informative ideas you offered. Certainly our understanding of justification as it relates to ethics and leadership is far more informed as a result of our time together today. Or perhaps, at the very least, we leave with more questions. I'm reminded of the advice offered by poet Rainier Maria Wilkie, to live the questions now, so we continue to live in this very complex but very important space of ethics, morality, and leadership. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Bernice. Thank you, everyone.